She is the Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, came into office 2014 as a result of the merger of our Human Rights Commission with our equality body, a very positive step forward. Prior to that, she was the Ombudsman for Children and indeed was chair of the European Network of Ombudsmen of Children, a high honour indeed. Yesterday, Maurice Manning opened these proceedings, albeit not in person but in word, by reflecting on the arc of our sovereignty from closure or near absolute closure to at least relative openness. And Emily's organisation, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, is right at the cusp of that dialectic between international law and domestic law, allowing a lot of the fresh air of international law to inform, not dictate, to inform domestic processes of change at home. And I won't say the Irish Human Rights Commission is key to the next 100 years, but it's certainly key to the next dozen years or so ahead in our future. So Emily, over to you.
Thank you so much. What a nice group you are to agree to stay sitting and listen to me before you have your coffee. I really appreciate it. I suppose I stand before you, as Mairead says, as somebody who feels vaguely intimidated having heard such wonderful contributions over the 2 days. And secondly, I also, I suppose, have suffered a little bit of psychological trauma, having realised at this late stage of my biological life that I will never reach the zenith of all womanhood. It's clear here this weekend that the commemorations have been much more than a simple act of remembrance. Rather, they've presented an opportunity for a wider reflection on Ireland's place in the world in 2016, for a critical appraisal of the successes and failures of the project that is self-government that Irish people embarked upon in the last century, while also providing here in NUI Galway for violent disagreement, I think is the word the column used, between constitutional theorists. This weekend's conference has made a significant contribution to this critical appraisal, and the subjects explored over the past 2 days illustrate the huge potential that sovereignty can open up to a country and its people. By the same token, our discussions have also thrown up the myriad failures and what Colm referred to as the latent paradoxes that a sovereign Ireland fostered either by omission or by design. And we continue to grapple with the legacy of these failures today. We understand now that the term sovereignty is loaded with many interesting meanings that go beyond its strict legal sense. And over the course of the early 20th century, the term served as a placeholder for a whole gamut of goals, hopes and aspirations that different Irish people held for this country. Donnchadh referred to the proclamation and the democratic programme for the First Dáil in 1919, both of which invoked national sovereignty, not only to assert narrow political independence, but also to project a set of values of what sovereign Ireland should be or could be. These visions vary greatly within these two documents, but between them they include equality and equal suffrage for men and women, the bridging of the sectarian divide, collective control over the country's resources. The protection of children's rights, as Ursula referenced, lies not in the proclamation, as often misreferenced, but the democratic programme of the First Dáil, with an explicit reference to the duty of government to protect socio-economic rights of children. These visions speak for Ireland to the potential that sovereignty carries, while standing in sharp contrast to what sovereignty actually came to mean for many Irish people after the Anglo-Irish Treaty. On the way down, I wrote these notes, and my next sentence begins, "Sovereignty can mean," and I wasn't sure whether to scribble it out after hearing today's first session, so bear with me and let me be brave and tell you what I originally wrote was that sovereignty can mean self-determination, dignity and independence. It can mean cultural revival and the growth of a nation's consciousness. It can mean the embrace and the active pursuit of human rights and equality. And then, depending on who invokes it, sovereignty can mean the maintenance of the status quo or its outright rejection. It can reflect a limited, inward-looking vision of a country's place in the world, where freedom from outside interference is the primary advantage it confers. Or it can reflect a view of a nation placing itself on the global stage in an active and engaged community of nations, each enjoying, in the words of the 1944 UN Charter, sovereign equality. I think it's fair to say that since the 1918 elections, Irish sovereignty has, at different stages, meant all of these things. They've always coexisted in a state of tension and latent paradox. Much of what has been discussed over the course of this conference is what happens when the notion of sovereignty moves from the realms of the radical assertion of popular sovereignty of 1916 to that of law, politics and the state. Ursula referenced how a sovereign Ireland took its place in the world in the 1930s through active participation in the League of Nations, where Eamon de Valera, as acting president of the League's Assembly in 1932, made an impassioned call for the voices of small sovereign nations to make a real difference in world affairs. He also spoke of his vision of a sovereign Ireland that acts, and I quote, in terms not of selfish interest, not of the acquisition of territory, nor of petty power, but of human beings living as if they have a right to live, in the best that their own energies and our state can give them, whilst contributing to the world the best that is in us. This sentiment of sovereign Ireland contributing to the world remained after Second World War, and to this day has informed Ireland's modern reputation, not only in international development, but also through its engagement with the United Nations, which we saw on Easter Monday. Even though we didn't see any grand missiles, we did see many of the peacekeepers, many of those who contributed as global advocates for human rights, and most recently, the example of Ireland's membership of the UN Human Rights Council between 2012 and 2015. But at home, of course, sovereignty meant the practicalities of state building and state government, and with self-government came the exercise of extreme power and control. And Owen spoke this morning about the distribution of power within the state in the context of judicial review. Structuralist thinkers have approached sovereignty as something both intentional and interlinked with society's disciplinary power. That is, the ability of state and society together to regulate the behaviour of individuals in the social body, with the kind of punishing transgressions that we heard Mairead speak about this morning. A sovereign Ireland developed its own approach to this over the 20th century, its own form of governmentality. As Foucault would term it, I know all those LLM students get upset when you mention Foucault, that came to oversee the conduct of individual communities at every level of society. But this weekend's conference has explored a wide range of mechanisms of control that a sovereign Ireland developed in the intersecting realms of law, society, religion, and in the spaces between public and private spheres. Indeed, a much-needed subject of reflection over the course of the month's commemorations has been the fact that the definition, what Colin referred to this morning, is the lack of definition of people and how it remains unresolved. And how, as a result, an inward-looking sovereign Ireland rendered swathes of Irish society invisible, marginalised, subaltern. Both Mairead and Conor talked about gender equality. Mairead referenced the invisibility of women in such cases as Jimsy, and how they were, as a friend of mine says, airbrushed. It's a particular type of airbrushing that we do in Ireland, so airbrushing out of history of women's role. We heard through the Feminist Judgments Project how women's individual autonomy and private lives became subject to ever greater controls, and those women who fell outside this vision faced the disciplinary power of state and society acting in concert, ostracised, silenced, exiled, imprisoned. We, an awkward and inward-looking sovereign Ireland, stunted by decades the progress towards gender equality, and we heard that from Conor in the context of jury trial, insulating Irish women from the advances made by our neighbours, with cases like McGee and de Burca, as Tom said, accelerating social change. Now, the other thing I read, and I didn't read all of it, I skipped, I have to say, to chapter 2, was Pope Francis' Amor Laetitia, published on Friday. But if you go to chapter 2, titled Experiences and Challenges of Families, Pope Francis, while the doctrine doesn't change, Pope Francis states that history is burdened by the excesses of patriarchal cultures that considered women inferior. He challenges the notion that many of today's problems have arisen because of feminine emancipation, suggesting that we must see in the women's movement the working of the spirit for a clearer recognition of the dignity and rights of women. We continue to deal with the legacy of this today, whether coming to terms with the legacy of the Magdalen laundries and symphysiotomy, or grappling with the continuing constitutional questions that surround women's bodily autonomy and their role in the life of the nation. Ursula, in her own paper, outlined a sovereign Ireland that was also a cold house for children. For decades, thousands of children suffered abuse, institutionalisation and poverty, treatment that was a far cry from the vision laid out in Ireland's first document in that first stall in 1919. But the abuse and neglect perpetrated on this scale, there were over 130,000 children chronicled in the Rhine report. This scale would not have been possible without the complicity and marriage of sovereign political and social power. It is no coincidence that the vast majority of children who suffered in this way came from marginalised backgrounds. And what of sovereign Ireland in 2016? We continue to face enormous challenges when it comes to putting an end to the marginalisation and invisibility of vulnerable and invisible members of our society. The recent revelations around Ors Attracta, the persistence and exclusion of travellers and Roma, the homelessness crisis and the system, as somebody in the audience referred to, of direct provision. I'd like just to reflect on some of the outward aspects or outward-facing aspects of Irish sovereignty and how Ireland has benefited from playing an active role in the community of nations. And Ursula referred to the transformative nature of the interaction with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child. The Irish Human Rights Commission, and Gerard referenced its provenance in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, and today is the 18th anniversary, Donncha, an historical international treaty that recast our understanding of Irish sovereignty and cemented Irish commitment to principles of human rights and equality on a far deeper institutional level. And central to that agreement was the close commitment of all parties to the European Convention on Human Rights, to which Ireland was a founding signatory. And perhaps more than any other international forum, Ireland's engagement with this convention, as Donncha had said earlier, has been formative. Beyond the ECHR, Ireland's engagement with the international human rights treaty system and its ratification of a range of human rights instruments has seen the state tested against increasingly exacting human rights standards. While progress on implementation of such treaties is slow, particularly given Ireland's continued adherence to a dualist interpretation of our constitutional system, which Donncha referred to earlier, and in my capacity as Chief Commissioner, I attend all of these state hearings. I've now attended enough to see the same representatives from the Attorney General's office speak to a largely very well-informed audience of international experts, largely jurists and legal scholars, and explaining the principle of dualism and why it is that we cannot incorporate these treaties into our domestic laws. But commitments to these international standards in principle, if not always indeed, is something which we have seen value, and Ursula has already referred to that. A priority for ourselves as the Commission in the coming months and years is to encourage further enhancement and informing, I think was the word Gerard used, of Ireland's commitment to international human rights standards. For instance, through the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Person with Disabilities comes to mind, since we have Gerard in the room who played a significant role in its development. But whether at EU, Council of Europe or UN level, and in contrast perhaps the sentiments currently being aired in the context of the Brexit and Human Rights Act debates, Ireland has not developed the same level of Euroscepticism, even if it means that we're relaxed and non-thinking in a globalised, cosmopolitan world. But in a world as connected as our own, sovereignty will always be, in one way or another, shared. And Ireland wears this reality well. Ireland has gleaned the benefits from such an approach, allowing scrutiny from outsiders, be it the regional EU level or international human rights system, to cast a light and shed a light on our own problems with which we often feel great discomfort. The process has left Ireland improved and not diminished. To conclude, I just want to observe that in 2016 we face a crisis on a scale not seen since the Second World War. It would be remiss of me not to mention it today. In this context, leadership from countries such as Ireland has never been more crucial. On Friday, the Commission issued a statement airing our concerns about the refugee crisis, and in particular on the failings of the recent EU-Turkey agreement, which, in our view, represents a worrying abandonment of fundamental human rights principles upon which it was founded, the indivisible universal values of human dignity, freedom, equality and solidarity. We're not naive enough to think that this will make a huge difference to the fate of these vulnerable people. It's important to speak up for our fellow human beings caught up in a nightmare situation. And here I should commend and acknowledge the developing sophistication of our own civil society here in Ireland. But it is important to speak up for our fellow human beings, reflecting the failed policies and responses of so many states and international institutions. Ireland does have a laudable record, and I don't want to get into the small country punching above our weight analogy, but we have done well in terms of the international reputation that we hold for human rights. In College Green in 2011, Barack Obama, echoing the international view of Ireland, said that we're a nation that met its responsibilities by choosing to apply the lessons of our own past and assume a heavier burden of responsibility on the world stage. My thanks to the speakers for the last 2 days. You've been fantastic. You have challenged us, you have frightened us, depressed us, angered us, informed us, sometimes entertained us, but most of all have inspired us. So thank you all for your contributions, and my thanks to NUIG for a great session. Take care.